Right, so relations between Egypt and Israel are continuing to erode despite the pro-Israel leanings of Egypt's President Sisi. He's been unable to excuse Israeli atrocity in Gaza. He has, it must be said, been leading the calls for a restructuring plan in Gaza that does not involve the ethnic cleansing of the Strip. But of course such plans have been scorned by the likes of Israel and Donald Trump, who much prefer the idea of just taking over Gaza and ridding themselves of the populace. Where Egypt has put military hardware, tanks and the like in the Sinai as a show of force previously, but ostensibly nothing more than that, growing Egyptian dissatisfaction with Sisi's position, and especially now that Israel has declared its absolute intent to displace the entire Gazan population, does seem to have signalled something of a shift. By taking over Gaza, Israel has declared its de facto intent to dump the peace accords between Egypt and Israel, the Camp David Accords, already having been violated for well over a year as they have been, without Egypt intervening. But now the real prospect of potentially 2 million Palestinians being displaced into the Sinai, and the destabilisation this would cause to Egypt, is a very real threat. Whether Sisi would finally take military action against Israel at this point is not entirely clear, but he has just done something that has sent Israel into absolute panic, and is of enormous concern to the US too, as it happens. So perhaps it might be just a matter of watch this space now. Right, so what was once an enduring peace between Israel and Egypt may be at the point of collapse, with President Sisi of Egypt left with no more room to ignore an increasing Israeli threat to Egypt. The Camp David Accords, once hailed as a diplomatic triumph for regional stability, are facing their greatest existential threat since their inception in 1978. Benjamin Netanyahu is using it for Tinder right now. Now, I've speculated in the past that the Accords have been collapsing on this channel before. They've largely survived because Sisi has not reacted to Israeli breaches of them. The seizure of the Philadelphia corridor in and of itself, for example, that border effectively between Egypt and Gaza, which Israel is supposedly not permitted in. A blatant example of that, as that is. But in the name of diplomacy, arguably, Sisi let it lie, even if this has made him deeply unpopular in Egypt. However, Benjamin Netanyahu's plan now to seize all of Gaza for Israel and ethnically cleanse the entire Gazan population would shred that peace agreement with Egypt utterly. And so it is against that backdrop that tensions are becoming increasingly hostile between Israel and Egypt again now. Now, while Egypt has for too long frankly tolerated Israel's actions in Gaza, the scope and ambition of Netanyahu's plan, or Trump's plan as we should be calling it, as it basically is, alongside all of the genocidal implications of Israel's ongoing war, they have incited deep alarm in Cairo. Israeli control of Gaza raises the spectre of ethnic cleansing, mass displacement, and Israeli encroachment even into Egypt and on Egypt's own territorial security, something that Sisi cannot possibly get away with turning a blind eye to. Already warned his placation of Israel risks his position if he doesn't do something. And so this has led to an increasing shift in Egyptian military and diplomatic policy. Certainly we started to see that in the last few months when tanks appeared in the Sinai, but it's moved on a little bit since then. In short, the Gaza war risks spreading beyond Gaza. It's no longer merely a humanitarian tragedy, it is fast becoming a driver for a broader regional conflict if Israel and Egypt come to blows over this, as seems likely if Netanyahu gets his way with Gaza. Too much of the world still sitting on its hands as they are, too much hand-wringing being done, not enough doing stuff. At the heart of the current crisis is Netanyahu's widely condemned plan, of course, to completely conquer Gaza. What began supposedly as a retaliatory operation against Hamas for what they did on October 7th, action to rescue hostages taken, has over the last 19 months of sustained bombardment become a policy now being enacted that amounts to a war of starvation on the entire Gazan populace. But it's all been exposed since that October 7th, since the inception, to have been in reality just an excuse to mount a campaign to depopulate Gaza, dismantle its governance, seize it entirely. The human cost has been catastrophic as a result, with tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians killed, mostly women and children, 2 million people now being pushed to the brink of famine and disease. For Egypt, though, this is not just a moral or a humanitarian concern, of which they have been heavily outspoken. They have, of course, been deeply involved in mediation and negotiation, though Israel, of course, have not been honest brokers in that. It is a direct national security threat as well. Perhaps they should have been more proactive a lot sooner. Though I always have said on this channel, diplomacy first. But that can only work with people who can be reasoned with, and Netanyahu clearly can't. The displacement of millions of Palestinians into the Sinai Desert, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, as Egypt fears, could happen through Israel's plan of conquest, and displacement would effectively export the entire crisis into Egyptian territory. Cairo's long feared that Israel would use the chaos of war to pressure or force Palestinians into the Sinai as part of a de facto ethnic cleansing operation. The permanent settlement of displaced Palestinians on Egyptian soil would upend Egypt's demographics and political balance. It would place unbearable strain on an already fragile economy as Egypt's is right now. 2 million people suddenly being dumped on any economy in the world would do that. Never mind one that's not necessarily in the best of shape right now. And inflaming domestic unrest, as would clearly be obvious from that. Despite Egypt's mediation role, though, Sisi has long been seen as one of Israel's most cooperative Arab leaders with Israel, largely due to Israel's tacit support for his own rise to power following the ousting of former President Mohamed Morsi. But the Gaza war has begun to fracture that relationship. There's no way it can continue to be tenable, and no way Sisi can retain power himself, carrying on like he is. Sisi's initial silence and inaction drew widespread condemnation from the Egyptian public, where anti-Israel sentiment remains deeply entrenched. The two nations warred with each other for decades before the Camp David Accords came into being. So with his position and his legitimacy under strain, the Egyptian president might be repositioning a little bit at last. We thought we saw some of this before, of course, when Sisi did go and park a load of tanks in the Sinai as a warning to Israel, but it's not been heeded. So Egypt is now actively considering a significant military build-up in the Sinai on top of that. It's not this, though, that has got Israeli sphincters clenching. It's what Sisi has recently procured by way of military hardware that's done that. You see, the Egyptian arsenal has recently added to its scope with the deployment of advanced Chinese-made J-35 stealth fighter jets, along with China's advanced radar systems, which may rival or even surpass the performance of Israel's Western-made F-35s. The procurement of this Chinese military hardware represents a turning point in Cairo's strategic posture, therefore, a move away from dependence on Western military support, as Egypt has always had, and becoming more independent by sourcing jets from its BRICS ally China. Jets the US wouldn't give to Egypt, incidentally, because Israel's military superiority in the Middle East must be maintained. Well, China might be upsetting that a little bit. The J-35 is designed with radar-absorbing materials, apparently, and boasts advanced avionics, so it poses a credible counter to the F-35 on paper, though many claim it to just be an F-35 rip-off because China have been hacking the US defence procurements and designs and technology. But even if that is true, it's still bad news for Israel because they still lose their edge, don't they? Coupled with new radar systems that are apparently capable of disrupting Israeli military capabilities, Egypt's acquisition signals that Cairo is preparing not just for deterrence, but potentially for a confrontation here. If you combine that with the fact that Egypt are not nearly as militarily weak as they once were under Sisi, himself former military, he can say anything that he's done that's been pretty good for Egypt. He has been building up Egypt's defence capabilities for several years to the point that they can mount a challenge on Israel and not struggle necessarily in the way they have in wars gone by. Yet at the end of the day, everything Netanyahu is doing, he is also doing for self-preservation, as much as we can argue that Sisi is doing that maybe. So if war with Egypt is required to keep him in power, you'll know he'll absolutely go there. Military posturing aside, the diplomatic relationship between Egypt and Israel is also rapidly deteriorating. Egypt has, for example, refused to accredit Israel's newly appointed ambassador for Egypt, leaving the position vacant since the previous envoy's term ended last year. Israel apparently appointed a replacement 5 months ago, but without Egyptian accreditation, he's been left in limbo. Meanwhile, Israel's own accusations, such as the IDF claim that Egypt attempted to smuggle weapons into Gaza by drones, have further soured relations. And whilst these claims remain completely unsubstantiated, as per usual when it comes to Israel, take our word or you're a racist, their timing is typically suspicious as Israeli forces continue to seize Gazan territory. So any suggestion of Egyptian complicity in trying to arm Gaza fighters could be used to justify later Egyptian incursions, of course. For Israel, the threat posed by Egypt's military modernisation still happens to be a serious strategic concern. The combination of Egypt's J-35 fighters, its expanding military forces more generally, tanks parked on the lawn, so to speak, they're in the Sinai, they're on the right side of the border, but still, already potentially being bolstered by more hardware going that way as well, and this new radar capability to go with those Chinese jets. It all represents a real challenge to Israeli regional dominance that the arrogant apartheid state just isn't used to. Israel's own track record of viewing Egypt as a long-term adversary further complicates the picture. In past military planning documents, Israel has reportedly considered options as extreme as targeting the Aswan Dam in Egypt, covered previously as I did in another video, an act that would constitute a declaration of war, not to mention would be a massive humanitarian disaster, the likes of which we perhaps have never seen. In light of such plans leaking and Israel's current expansionist strategy in Gaza, it is driving Egyptian defence circles to rethink previously held assumptions about peace ever being able to last between the two states. Moreover, Israeli right-wing rhetoric about a greater Israel that extends beyond its current borders and which very much includes seizing the Sinai feeds further into justified Egyptian fears. With every airstrike and every inch of territory in Gaza seized, Netanyahu risks waking those dormant fears, as they still are at the moment, in Cairo and across the Arab world, in fact, that Israel's ambitions are no longer confined to Palestinian land. And if war is all that can possibly keep Netanyahu out of court on those corruption charges and in power, of course, then he's going to keep on waging it as far as he needs to, daring the West not to help him if push comes to shove to save their little colonialist project in the Middle East. Despite Sisi's ongoing passivity, the tide may be turning. Mounting public anger over Egypt's failure to prevent the occupation of Gaza and broader Israeli encroachments in the Middle East has shaken his domestic standing. Previously confident in his image as a regional strongman with Israeli and American backing, Sisi now finds himself at a crossroads to either assert Egypt's red lines with force, or risk being seen as a puppet of foreign powers and far too close to Israel itself, which has been the most damaging aspect of all for him. So the procurement of Chinese stealth aircraft may be Sisi's clearest signal yet that he is prepared to do something at last. If these military capabilities are deployed in a meaningful way, particularly to enforce Egyptian sovereignty in the Sinai or to deter Israeli movements along the border regions, they could fundamentally shift power dynamics in the region. Egyptian threats to target Tel Aviv have already been made. They just haven't been backed up yet. Yet the question keeps being asked, for how long will Egypt put up with what is happening in Gaza? Will they wait until it's too late and 2 million Palestinians arrive on their doorstep, or do something to stop that? Do something before then, having frankly been waiting too long already, like so much of the world? At the very least, tolerance of Israeli control of the Rafah border crossing and the Philadelphia corridor should have ended, surely. So things like that you can't help but think that while open war remains unlikely, but it's Sisi's position on the line too, and he knows it. In the shadow of Gaza's ruins, the Middle East may be witnessing the slow death of one of its most vital peace accords, the Camp David Agreement. Once a beacon of diplomacy in a war-torn region, now hangs by a thread after 46 years as Israel's military ambitions collide with Egyptian national interest. Netanyahu's strategy to fully conquer Gaza, displace its population and assert permanent control over the territory has not only pushed Palestinians to the edge of annihilation, it's leaving Egypt with a choice to make, with a leader who for far too many seems desperate to avoid making it. Cairo's turn to Chinese military technology, its freeze on diplomatic ties with Israel, and its growing alignment with global calls for Palestinian statehood do, however, all point to something having shifted. But how much more damage to Gaza must be done, how much more risk to Egypt by association must there be before they finally take some action of their own? For more on that purported threat to the Aswan High Dam, check out my coverage on that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.